missing years. What's that? There is a period of approximately 200 years that is not reflected in the Jewish calendar. This period is known as the missing years or the unaccounted years, and it refers to a time period in Jewish history when there is little information available about the chronology of events. The Jewish calendar is based on the traditional counting of years that begins with the creation of the world, as described in the Hebrew Bible. According to Jewish tradition, the world was created in the year 1 of the Jewish calendar. However, there are several historical events that occurred between the creation of the world and the establishment of the Jewish calendar as we know it today, and the dating of these events is somewhat unclear. One of the most significant events that occurred during this period was the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Following this event, many Jews were exiled to Babylon, and it is believed that some of the historical records and chronologies were lost or destroyed during this time. As a result, there is a gap of approximately 200 years in the Jewish calendar between the destruction of the first temple and the establishment of the current calendar system. While there are some historical records and dating methods that have been used to try to fill in this gap, there is still a significant amount of uncertainty about the exact chronology of events during this period. Despite this gap in the Jewish calendar, the tradition of counting years from the creation of the world has been maintained, and the Jewish calendar is still widely used today for determining the dates of religious holidays and other important events. So based on the unaccounted years, which approximate 200 years, which year of Jewish calendar are today? It is difficult to determine exactly how many years are missing from the Jewish calendar, and there is no consensus among scholars about the exact length of the missing period. Estimates range from 165 to 250 years, depending on the method of calculation and the assumptions made. If we assume that the missing period is around 200 years, and we add that to the current Jewish year, 5783, we would get a rough estimate of 5,983 as the current Jewish year if we were to include the missing years. However, it's important to note that this estimate is not based on any established historical or religious tradition, and it is not widely accepted in Jewish scholarship or practice. In any case, the Jewish calendar as it is currently used and recognized by Jewish communities around the world is based on the traditional counting of years from the creation of the world, and it does not include the missing years. The current Jewish year is 5,783, based on this traditional counting system. Where did this idea come from? The idea of the missing years in the Jewish calendar dates back to ancient times, and it has been discussed and debated by Jewish scholars and historians for centuries. The earliest reference to this issue can be found in the Talmud, a central text of Judaism that was compiled in the early centuries CE. The Talmud describes a disagreement among the sages about the exact length of the missing period, with some suggesting that it was as short as 52 years and others suggesting that it was as long as 165 years. Over the centuries, various Jewish and non-Jewish scholars have attempted to calculate the length of the missing period using different methods, such as analyzing historical records, astronomical data, and the genealogies of biblical figures. However, there is no consensus among scholars about the exact length of the missing period, and estimates continue to vary widely. Some estimates of the missing period range from around 165 years to as much as 250 years. For example, the 165-year estimate is based on the chronology developed by the 16th century Jewish historian Joseph Ben-Gurion, while the 250-year estimate is based on the chronology developed by the 17th century Irish Archbishop James Ussher. It's important to note that these estimates are based on assumptions and interpretations, and there is no definitive historical or scientific evidence to support them. The exact length of the missing period remains a subject of scholarly debate and speculation. Where do these assumptions and interpretations first time appear in the history? The assumptions and interpretations regarding the missing years in the Jewish calendar have a long and complex history, dating back to ancient times. The earliest reference to the issue can be found in the Talmud, a central text of Judaism that was compiled in the early centuries CE. The Talmud describes a disagreement among the sages about the exact length of the missing period, with some suggesting that it was as short as 52 years and others suggesting that it was as long as 165 years. In the centuries that followed, various Jewish and non-Jewish scholars attempted to calculate the length of the missing period using different methods and sources of information. For example, some scholars relied on historical records, while others used astronomical data or the genealogies of biblical figures. These calculations and interpretations were often influenced by the cultural and intellectual contexts in which they were developed, as well as by the religious and political concerns of the scholars involved. For example, in the 16th century, the Jewish historian Joseph Ben-Gurion developed a chronology of Jewish history that included a 165-year gap between the destruction of the First Temple and the reconstruction of the Second Temple. Gurion's chronology was widely accepted in the Jewish community at the time, and it influenced subsequent Jewish and non-Jewish scholars who studied the issue. In the 17th century, the Irish Archbishop James Ussher developed a chronology of world history that also included a 250-year gap in the Jewish calendar. Ussher's chronology was based on a combination of biblical genealogies and astronomical observations, and it became influential in Christian circles. Since then, many other scholars and researchers have attempted to calculate the length of the missing period using various methods and sources of information. However, there is still no consensus among scholars about the exact length of the missing period, and the issue remains a subject of scholarly debate and speculation. How did the Jewish historian Joseph Ben-Gurion get the result of 165 missing years? The exact method that Joseph Ben-Gurion used to arrive at the 165-year gap in Jewish history is not entirely clear, as he did not provide a detailed explanation of his calculations in the Sefer Yosippin. However, it is likely that his chronology was based on a combination of biblical genealogies, historical accounts, and other sources of information available to him at the time. One of the primary sources that Joseph Ben-Gurion likely relied on was the biblical book of Ezra, which provides a detailed account of the reconstruction of the Second Temple after the Babylonian exile. Ezra 3 verses 8-13 states that the foundation of the Second Temple was laid in the second month of the second year after the return from exile. Based on this information, Joseph Ben-Gurion may have calculated that there was a 52-year gap between the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BCE and the beginning of the reconstruction of the Second Temple in 534 BCE. However, this calculation does not account for the fact that the Second Temple was not completed until many years later, during the reign of Darius I of Persia. Joseph Ben-Gurion may have used additional sources of information to determine the length of this delay, which could have included historical records, oral traditions, and astronomical observations. It is also possible that Joseph Ben-Gurion's chronology was influenced by other Jewish historical and literary works that were circulating in his time, such as the books of Chronicles and Josephus' Jewish War. These works often included their own chronologies of Jewish history, and they may have provided additional information and context for Joseph Ben-Gurion's calculations. In addition to Joseph Ben-Gurion, there have been several other Jewish scholars and historians over the centuries who have attempted to calculate the missing years in Jewish chronology. Some of the most notable include Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi of Vienna, 14th century. Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi was a Talmudic scholar who lived in the 14th century. He believed that the missing years were due to errors in the biblical genealogies, and he suggested that the true length of the Babylonian exile was 50 years rather than the traditional 70 years. He also argued that the Second Temple was not destroyed until the year 423 BCE, which would reduce the length of the missing period. Rabbi Azariah de Rossi, 16th century. Rabbi Azariah de Rossi was an Italian Jewish scholar who lived in the 16th century. He was critical of the traditional Jewish chronology and argued that it was based on faulty assumptions and incomplete evidence. He suggested that the missing years could be attributed to errors in the biblical text, and he proposed a revised chronology that differed significantly from the traditional one. Rabbi Samuel ben Isaac, 12th century. Rabbi Samuel ben Isaac was a Jewish scholar who lived in the 12th century. He suggested that the missing years could be attributed to mistakes made by the scribes who copied the biblical texts over the centuries. He argued that the scribes may have omitted or added certain passages, resulting in a distorted chronology. These are just a few examples of the many Jewish scholars and historians who have attempted to solve the mystery of the missing years in Jewish chronology. While their theories and calculations have varied widely, they all share a fascination with the history of the Jewish people and a desire to understand the true timeline of Jewish history. Shalom friends! Thanks for watching, subscribe, give us a thumbs up and leave your comments down below.